Hello world, this is Shruti Pandey, and today I have with me another founder, Gil Cohen, who is the founder of Employee Experience Design. He's a very, very dear friend. We've spoken a couple of times. I love the way he's always so bubbly, inspiring, and like full of life. And plus, the background he has is like ever growing, and I love his kid for that. So, thank you so much, Gil. Thank you so much for giving me your time and doing the amazing job that you're doing right now for all of us.
Thank you so much for having me. And I appreciate that you appreciate my background. My boys worked hard on it. And so it's always a point of pride for them when I tell them about that somebody liked it.
I think everybody likes it. Like, don't try to be modest and you're like trying to be like a
I
daughter.
will admit, it's not for everybody. It can be overwhelming for some people. It can be distracting for some people. People have, and I've appreciated the honest feedback from some people that it's a little much for them. So then I blur my background for those people. But hey, we all have different brains. We all have different kind of senses, the way we internalize these things. And if a person, is honest enough to say, look, I'm having a hard time with the conversation or whatever, I appreciate that. I respect.
To say that and be so honest. It takes.
Yeah, and absolutely, absolutely. Especially because, you know, generally I don't think people are trying to hurt other people's feelings. And I take a certain pride. It's my boys who drew that. Well, my wife also drew some of it, but it's my family that drew that. And so the person's trying not to hurt my feelings or anything like that and saying it, and they're not, because they're just saying, look, this is how I am internalizing the situation. It's a little much.
And on that note, I have created three questions for you. So, shall we start with the questions?
Sounds good.
Okay, awesome. So my first question for you is, it might be, I mean, it might sound very cliched for you, but I think it's important for the world right now and the way things are turning up. And to give a little preface to the audience who would be watching this, Gil is somebody who created an employee experience guide, which I was lucky enough to beta test around last year. So he is just an amazing man, and he didn't give me anything to sell this, but I just have to put in a good word, like a good friend, I hope, because I consider him my people. And really, he has done a phenomenal job. And my first question for you is about the same thing, like, what is employee experience really?
Okay, so what employee experiences, this is the way I've always internalized it, because employee experience right now, it's one of the difficult things is a lot of people are applying their own definitions to it. And this is the way I've kind of learned it. And it's because it's come a lot from the world of user experience and customer experience. And so for me, a really foundational video I saw probably about 5 years ago now was a UX designer here in Toronto. And he was giving a speech, but I watched the video on LinkedIn, and it was back when you could be in person comfortably and all of that.
Yeah.
But he was giving a speech, and it changed my perspective on things, because it was a speech on how everything in life is user experience. Everything we do in life is user experience. The example he happened to use was the chairs that people were sitting on, and how they were designed around the user's experience, because they were there for listening, and being comfortable, but in ergonomic, but they're built around the user. And he was saying that generally. But for me, as a person who's been in the people world and in the org design world my whole career, what started to dawn on me was the fact that, well, what's the most profound user experience we have but being an employee somewhere?
Mm,
Because employee experience is just the user experience of being employed at an organization.
sure.
Because other user experience, your phone, for example, well, you're thinking about like how comfortable it is to hold and push the buttons and how fast it is and all of that. It impacts you, and all of our own phones impact us a lot these days because we're all addicted. But it impacts you only to a certain point. Whereas your employee experience, it impacts you full circle around your entire health profile, around your entire, all of your dimensions of wellness, because there is the aspect of, the first thing often people think of is pay. So certainly pay is a part of the user experience of work because it impacts your life outside of it. What kind of house you're able to afford, what kind of life you're able to afford, how many vacations you can go on, if any, for the year,
Yeah.
right? But then there's also elements of your manager. Your manager has a huge impact. Gallup did a study a few years ago that managers have a 70% of the variance between people's engagement is directly from managers. So, HR organizations around the world are trying to push for engagement when 70% of that engagement comes from managers. Well, your manager often is the reason why you can't sleep well at night. They're the
Or leave the
reason,
company.
or leave the company, or have what many people call the Sunday scaries, when on Sunday night and you're so full of stress and you feel that in the pit of your
And this
stomach,
shouldn't happen.
it ruins your weekend. It absolutely ruins your weekend.
Yeah.
So employee experience is the sum of all of the interactions and all of the touch points you have with an organization. And that can be anything from the physical, if you're going into the office, what does the office look like? What are the chairs like, et cetera? Growing of importance in since the pandemic is the digital employee experience, because a lot of people, 90+% of their employee experience now is entirely in the digital realm.
Yeah.
So that completely impacts how a person relates to their organization. But it's not just the what. It's not just, oh, do we use Slack? Do we use Teams? But it's also, how are those things used? Are we sending messages after hours and expecting people to respond?
Yeah.
Are we sending people messages that are intrusive in their day when they're trying to get work, and I expect a response immediately without giving consideration
Or
or anything
dropping
like
mail at 2 a.m. and being like, oh, I just dropped it because, all the reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so
Yeah.
employee experience is all of that. That's why it's so difficult and so complex, because it encapsulates every interaction a person has with a company. It could even be, what is the CEO posting on Twitter?
Yeah.
Even something like that, because that's your perception, your experience around the organization. If your CEO is posting things on LinkedIn or Twitter or another social media that you disagree with, it detracts from your engagement and your connection with the organization.
Yeah. Yes.
And so that employee experience, it's a tough answer to, I know it's the sum of all touch points or interactions a person has as a result of their employer, but it's a lot harder to really dive in to understand what that means, because it's everything.
I have a follow-up question, and a second question to this is, now that you've explained to all of us what employee experience is, why do we need to work on employee experience, really?
Okay, because employee experience is happening whether you work on it or not. And if you leave it unintentional, you're going to be left with many of the common organizational problems that exist out there. Whether it be something like silos, something as big in org design as silos, two different groups within or multiple groups working against each other, or on the micro level, whether it's how managers behave. And the reality is that employee experience creates your business outcomes, whether you design for them or not. Because what happens is that, like you said, if a bad manager, a person's more likely to leave.
Yeah.
Which costs cost companies a lot more than they realize. It's the cost of turnover is a lot higher than those small numbers that people like to put together of, oh, it's $500 here and no. It's not. Statistically, it's actually costing you more than the person's yearly salary when they leave. And the more skilled, the more experienced they are, it's actually costing the company more than that. So if the reactions, the emotions, and the productivity comes from a person's employee experience. If you have a company where the process is so convoluted that people are spending half their day working around the process and half their day working, they could be much more productive if they had 3/4 of their day working and then only a quarter of their day working on process. It's not just, and that's one of the misunderstandings that people have because it grows from this people world. It's not just about people feeling good. It is an outcome. People feeling good is an outcome, and people feeling good isn't the only outcome, because it's not just about, sitting around the campfire being happy together, but it's also about, are people able to live the lives they want? Is stress impacting them in a negative way? I forget the exact numbers, but the difference of living in certain cities because of the amenities and because of the healthcare in the US versus other areas. I remember the equivalent of living in San Francisco, I forget where the comparison area was the equivalent of curing cancer. That's the difference that these things can have on your life. So the impact of a work that we spend 100,000 plus hours of our life in work.
Absolutely.
So there's the two sides of it. Why should we care about employee experience? Because it actually impacts people's lives, but it also impacts the bottom line. If you create an experience that makes people want to stay, help them grow, help them feel autonomy, mastery of their work, connection with the people around them, inspiring, you'll get more out of them. It's a simple business answer of, you end up getting more from your people because they're more, it's not just engagement, but it's also they're more trusting. So they'll share more. They'll feel more psychological safety. So they'll be more themselves and be able to be more productive. So instead of thinking about politics 25% of the day, right, of internal politics of how do I work around this person, you just get the work done. You can just get the work done, and that for people is a lot to keep them around.
Well, I think simple things are most difficult, right? I totally echo your sentiments, and I genuinely feel we as humans fail to understand the beauty and simplicity. Like, it's literally that simple, and still we are talking about this in 2022. Like, but actually, it's good that at least somebody like you is talking about it, because it's the need of the hour, ironically. And I think the biggest fact is not just the simplicity part of it, the fact that people forget that the feel aspect is so undermined. Like, why can't we feel, and why can't we explain what we feel at a workplace? Like, I don't understand the suppression of everything and emotions. I
I
mean,
have an opinion on that. I have an opinion on why that is,
okay.
because a lot of the way our organizations were designed came from the first and second industrial revolution. And so what happened prior to that, the larger organizations were the military and religion. And so those were a different type of organization. And then a lot of smaller companies. But then as the world industrialized, people were seen as interchangeable. We were all just spare parts on an assembly line. So when in the 1920s, less than 25% of the American population had a high school degree, they could just pick and choose people. Oh, that person's not doing well, fine, we'll put somebody else. Oh, that person got sick because they were working in the coal mine, we'll find another person to work in the coal mine, or another child to work in the coal mine, whatever it is. But because of the paradigm was that of looking at the organization of a machine. And so all parts needed to be interchangeable, and they needed to be repeatable. They needed to do the same thing over and over again. However, we're in 2022. Gen Z, at least here in North America, is the most educated generation to enter the workforce. The complexity of the work that we do is not comparable to doing the same task over and over again on an assembly line. However, our paradigms, our ways of thinking go back to that time, and they're hard to break. which is why the idea of top-down leadership is still so common. You mentioned the simple things. One of the most simple things is just listening.
Oh,
Ask and listen. But the idea of voice of employee is so foreign for most companies that even here in 2022, because we still have that top-down leadership mindset of, oh, I'm the VP, it's my job to know how to run things.
yeah. Yeah.
Instead of understanding that the people on the front line see a lot that you don't see. And by listening to them, you'll be able to make better decisions. But our conditioning for many, many years is that this is how things are done. The boss's job is to tell the other people how to do the work. And there's a lot of people who've been thankfully fighting against it since before I entered the workforce, in terms of trying to make workforces more humanistic. And they come in different lenses, whether it be around servant leadership or around psychological safety, or it comes around the original intent around culture, wherever it might be. There is a lot of intent, but there's also a lot of inertia. That how do we break through it? Because a lot of the most successful companies were built on this old style of doing things. And even in micro areas in newer companies, it's all too common. So that's where I see it coming from, why so many bosses micromanage, why so many people feel a lack of autonomy, why they feel like, they have to do things the same way the company tells them. Because this is how companies were brought up, how they were raised.
You have no idea. You reminded me of so many things really in answering this question. Like, first of all, I think most of the countries, when the Renaissance or whatever, the way you want to call it, the Industrial Revolution really happened. A lot of the countries across the globe were basically facing, the post-war and post independence kind of a thing. So it was just about bringing food to the table. So the baby boomers were really doing that. They were just trying to get food on the table. So I sometimes feel, really sorry for them, because they were just striving so hard. Like, every time when we compare ourselves with other Gen X, baby boomers, etc., but they also saw a lot of hard things. And I think that's the reason why they used to be so happy in working for an organization 30 years of their life, 20 years of their life, because that was probably stability for them, getting a paycheck every month, bringing food to the table.
But you raised a great point, because that was actually possible back then.
Yeah.
That's the difference. In one of the ways I was taught about generational differences, and I'm sure there are parallels, but differences again with India, with independence, etc. But the way I was always taught it, because my dad is a baby boomer, okay? And the way he always taught it to me was this, is his father and mother's generation grew up in the Great Depression and lived through the Great Depression.
Yeah.
So to them, what they learned was a job was something you hold on to. You're lucky to have it, which is a lot of companies' attitude still. You're lucky to work for us. But that was what they were taught. You're lucky to have a job, work any job, and you work there for 20 to 30 years, and you retire, and they give you the gold watch.
Yeah.
Then what happened was my parents' generation, my father's generation in particular, because my mom's from somewhere else, but my father's generation was taught that, okay, you hold on to that job. You are loyal, you remain. And for many years, that was a possibility too. Then again, here in North America, starting in the 1970s and 1980s, that changed, because the companies started, through short-termism, deciding, oh, it's more important for us to hit our number than take care of these 1,000 people, because if we fire these 1,000 people, it comes off the books. And so there was right sizing, downsizing, etc. So now these baby boomers who were loyal to their companies were all getting laid off.
Yeah.
And Gen Xers like me saw it. And so Gen X like me were like, wait a minute, we were taught this, but then something different happened.
What did this happen?
What is going on here? But we didn't have the numbers to really have the influence and the impact until then millennials were taught what Gen Xers saw from the beginning. So instead of being taught be loyal, they were taught from the beginning, be loyal to yourself. And
No,
so what they,
that still didn't come to India for a long time. Be loyal to yourself. That didn't come for a
yeah,
long time. Yeah.
I can imagine. And look, it's still working its way through here in North America.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of Gen Xers and baby boomers look at Gen Z and millennials with contempt. I do not. I love millennials for the fact that they do this, for the fact that they will come in and you give me a bad work experience on
Yeah.
day one, I'm looking elsewhere. If
So
you didn't give me what you promised, whereas and now people of my generation will start to do it too. But when I entered the workforce 20 plus years ago, you couldn't even consider. Yeah, I joined the workforce in 2001.
you don't look your age, sorry.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. But yes, no, I joined the workforce in 2001, and that was after a few years of school. But at that time, you couldn't just leave a company quickly. You couldn't just be seen as that kind of job hopper. It really was a detriment to your career and your ability to find your next job. There's a lot more understanding of it now, as there should be, of the fact that sometimes people join a company and it's not what they were told.
Oh,
It's
yes.
not what they were sold, especially in this era of employer branding where companies know how to sell themselves very well.
Mhm.
A lot of them do it to market themselves in a way that is not authentic. And then when somebody joins a company, that's a bad employee experience. So going back to employee experience, one of the things that it's founded upon is that we're all individuals. So it's all individual based on our expectations and our perceptions. So if you were expecting one thing and coming into an employee experience that's different, that's an immediate negative, unless it's magically like, oh, we forgot we're paying you $30,000 more a year, which obviously doesn't happen. So any change is going to be, any difference is going to already get a person's frustration up and concerns up. And so that's something that millennials, though, they weren't taught be loyal. They were taught your companies, if they don't like you, they're going to cut you.
I mean,
They're
I
go
started working in 2011 and still I had never seen anybody in my family going to corporate job because my granddad and my father are both doctors. So I didn't understand the corporate world. I had never seen people taking a briefcase, going to office and doing stuff. So I had no idea about it. And, your previous answers have actually helped me understand two more things. One is, have you seen the movie Ford versus Ferrari, where the guy
No, I
comes,
haven't.
you should see that movie. It's so
Okay.
amazing. So I watched it on my birthday like 3 years back, and there's one scene where Henry Ford II comes in to the machine area where
Yeah.
he's like, just shut everything off because you're just spoiling and ruining the name Ford. And there was an entire row of the guys who wear coats and sitting in front of me in the multiplex, and I am behind sitting in the row with my parents. And I was like, oh bloody shit, this is how exactly happens. And all the men in front of me were having the same experience and emotions like me. And my mom is like, what did just happen? I was like, I'll explain it to you later. And it made me realize that exactly the industrial revolution, the way companies work then is exactly how the companies are working right now, which is why I felt that emotion. I was like, oh, bloody hell, this is true. And all those men sitting in front of me felt the same thing. And I'm so proud of myself today, for one thing, that back in 2016 at JP Morgan Chase, I used to have presentations around we are not able to handle Gen Y, then we will not be able to handle Gen Z in our workplace. And I did that for 2 3 years of my time at JP. And I feel so proud that I was doing something ahead of time, because now I understand it was so important to do. And I hope some of the VPs and EDs there still remember some message out of it.
That is ahead of its time, because I remember in 2017,
Uh-huh.
I saw a presentation at an employee experience conference about Gen Z at the time, and I think they hit everybody over the head with a hammer at the time, because in 2017 they pointed out, they're like, we've been talking about millennials for years. The entire millennial generation was in the workforce at the time.
Oh, yes.
That's the thing. We were already getting into Gen Zs into the workforce. But for us, because again, when I started in 2001, they were already starting to talk about that next generation of millennials. Gen X's like me, we had been written off. We were a bunch of slackers, but they were already looking at it wasn't called millennials. It was still called
Right.
Gen Y here. And they were looking into it, but they kept on looking into it for 15 years and they still never figured it out, because the ideas are so different. And I think that story in the movie was a very powerful one for a few reasons. One, it shows the impact of the movie on you and how it can evoke emotion, no question about
Was
that.
that to be really?
But the fact of the matter was that you were able to feel an emotion based on your own experienced trauma, from your own experienced negativity in the workforce of seeing that's what it's like, and then
I
knowing
didn't
the
even know
impact.
about it until I saw it on screen. Like it was my daily life. There's one more scene where, the driver takes Ford on a ride and he's like, this is how it feels for the racer. And Ford starts to cry because he's like, I didn't know about this. I didn't know how this feels. And my dad would have been so proud. And like you said a little while back, these folks don't understand what people at the baseline are doing for them day in, day out.
That is a great story, by the way, right there. The fact that he didn't know what it was like to be in a race car. He ran a car company. He was raised among a car company, and he had no idea, which shows the absolute disconnection between the people at the top too often and the user.
Yeah.
That's the thing, is that in every disconnect between the people who are making decisions and the user is going to just make for worse decisions. And who knows who's connected to the user? But the employees, the frontline people whose lives it is to live with them every day and know their problems and understand them. And yet leaders still keep this wide disconnect between themselves and the people who actually know what's happening. And that's one of the things I try to break. One of the walls I try to break is that leaders, when they know what a frontline employee's life is actually like, they can make better decisions for them. It's as simple as that. You can make better decisions because you can actually understand the implications of your decisions. How many of us on the front line have dealt with what the leadership thought was a good decision, but something that just made the rest of us miserable because they didn't ask the right questions beforehand? They just decided, oh, I read a book and it was good, I'm going to implement this now.
I can't believe with just that one question, we covered everything. Like this is a great playbook of yours if people want to just understand very simply about employee experience. And I want to ask you the third question and last question that I have for you, which is your vision is to make the world a better place to work, is what I read on your LinkedIn.
Yes.
Doesn't that involve changing mindset of people? And how are you planning to do so?
Yes, and very slowly over time. Changing mindsets is not an easy thing, but it has to be done from my experience, incrementally. It reminds me of a great story. I know many people have heard this one, but a man is walking on the beach and he sees and tide is going out and he sees a boy and there's starfish all over the beach. They're just littered all over the beach. And he sees a boy throwing starfish back in the ocean. The man walks up to the little boy and he's just throwing. And the man says, "What are you doing?" He's like, I'm throwing the starfish back in the ocean because if they don't, they're going to die because the tide's going out." And the man's like, "But there's thousands of starfish here. How do you expect to make a difference?"
Oh,
The boy
yeah.
smiles, throws the one he had in his hand, throws in the ocean, says, I made a difference to that one. And that's how one person at a time, one company at a time. That's all we can ask, in my opinion. It's an evolution, not a revolution, because the people at the top, their mindsets are too stuck in the old ways for a lot of them. And I don't want to like say, oh, they're terrible. It's just, that's how they were raised. That's how they were brought up. And that's what led to success for them. Right. And so if that's what they see, it's hard for them to see what they don't. It's hard for them to see the opportunity cost along the way if they had been asking the right questions and listening to the right people.
What's disheartening even more is we understand, we give that benefit of doubt to the elders, but sometimes this conditioning seeps into our generation, right? Like Gen X and Gen Y, and they start emulating the same way and behaving the same way, which is more problematic. And I think which is what has caused a lot of things in the current years, is how I look at it. But
Well, because we see that's how other people achieve success, right? Because organizations are built around listening to the loudest voice in the room. And so if you need to be the loudest voice in the room to be successful, then that's what some people are going to do. Is that actually beneficial for the organization? No, but that's what it's built on. That's how these structures have been built up, that these patriarchal way of thinking, this, dominant way of thinking. But when you look at the research and the studies, that's not actually the way you build the best companies, but it's just what's been successful up until this point. And so that's why we're used to it.
This has been such a great podcast, and I don't really want to end it, but thank you so much, Gil. Like seriously, I feel like having more parts to this conversation of ours.
Let's chat again.
Yeah, we may do something. We should do something more on this, because this has been a really, really amazing and eye-opening conversation. Thank you so much for this, and let me know if we should be doing one again. If
Sounds
that
good.
is-
Absolutely. I'd love to.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It was fun.